Hello, hello. I am Sinner, and I am back with another video. Today, I'm covering another book that I've finished, which is Physics by Aristotle. And this has to be the most boring book by Aristotle I've ever read. First of all, you might wonder, is it actually physics, or is it not physics? The answer is kind of. It's kind of physics. It's kind of not physics. It, in all of its writing, it's all basically just logical argumentation, but it's about physical things. So you can kind of say it's physics. To give an example of what I mean, he argues in this book that time exists, that change exists, that reality is in a constant state of motion, that space, vacuums don't exist on Earth, or vacuums don't exist. So the air isn't a vacuum. Um, as well as a few other things. He argues against the idea that everything has a fixed identity that doesn't change, and so on and so forth. So, in a way, it's physics, but in a way, it's kind of like not. You know what I mean? Because it's like so on the edge of being physics, like that. Um, it's hard to say. That being said, it was actually kind of interesting because, like, you don't really think about questions like, how do you know time is real? And what is time? And in this, he basically just argues that time is the medium by which change takes place, or the fulfillment of a potential into an actual. Um, so the I think that's kind of interesting. Um, and yeah, he makes arguments. So for example, with the one about void, it's like if you have an empty jar, the jar isn't actually empty, according to Aristotle. It's actually uh, it's actually full of air. And the argument he makes as to why he thinks that like air has mass is kind of interesting. He says if you throw a ball, the ball velocity slows down as you throw it. It goes, it doesn't go the same speed the whole time. And he says, well, if air was a void, if it was a vacuum, there would be nothing pushing against it to slow it down. So it would maintain the same velocity the whole time you threw it. But because it doesn't, we can know that air has some mass, you know. And it's all sort of like that. Does place exist? Um, he made it, and one of the things which he actually talked about, which I thought was kind of interesting because I heard this argument a long time ago and I forgot that this argument existed. Um, but it's the argument like made by a guy called Zeno where he's like, oh, if you have a line and you divide that line in half and then you divide that line in half again and do that ad infinitum, then technically when you walk the distance, you're walking an infinite distance because there's an infinite number of divisions in that distance, which is impossible. But he makes, and I didn't really understand the argument because I sort of just absorbed this book, but he makes an argument that basically the whole distance itself, no matter how you divide it, is always discrete, even though a line is continuous, meaning that it's infinitely divisible. Same with time. Time is continuous, so it's infinitely divisible. Um, and yeah, overall, I think it was actually quite interesting. There was a lot of things in here which you don't really think about being um, self-evident, but are sort of, well, you think of them as being self-evident, but they're called into question. Um, yeah, and I thought that was quite interesting. There was almost as well like an argument for evolution made at the time, because in one of the first books they talk about chance. Some Greek philosopher was talking about chance, And like the argument this guy was making was basically like, well, um, all the traits you have are chance by chance, but the perseverance of those particular traits is due to sort of environmental selection. So your constitution, everything about reality is sort of by chance. And Aristotle argues, which is basically an argument for evolution. He says like, um, the reason we have teeth that are like how they are is because people who had different teeth died off and all this sort of stuff. Um, and Aristotle makes the argument it doesn't matter that everything's by chance in this sense because it still has purpose. Because your teeth still have a purpose, whether or not that type of teeth was attained via some environmental selection predicated on chance is irrelevant. Everything about you still has a purpose, which I thought was actually kind of interesting because, some atheists will argue that, because we are products of evolution, that there's sort of like nothing has an inherent meaning, but it's weird to think that that conversation was had 2,300 years ago, and people had counter arguments to that already. Um, but yeah, one other thing I want to bring up about um, like philosophy books in general, and I'm not like hating on philosophy books or anything like that, um, but what I've noticed now when I've been getting into modern, like some of the more esoteric Aristotelian philosophy, is you get to a point where like this is the book, and all of this is commentary, and all of this is introduction stuff. So like all of this is just, which is actually about as long as the um, as physics itself. There's as much commentary on physics in this book as there is Aristotle's physics. And it's the same thing with posterior analytics. If I grab this one out, you're going to see like basically the same thing, except just worse, honestly. Uh, so for posterior analytics, which is also philosophy, this is posterior analytics by Aristotle. The rest of the book is commentary. All of this is commentary. This is posterior analytics. So like 70% of the book isn't even the book. Um, so that's going to be kind of interesting to sort of crunch through. I didn't actually read any of the uh, commentary because I'm a loser and I couldn't be bothered. But I probably will. I think I'll go back and revisit some of the arguments because I think there's stuff, there's meat to be chewed on there. He also, as he did in the metaphysics, made a unmoved mover argument, which was kind of interesting, seeing that in the physics. Um, and he sort of answers certain questions I had a bit in the metaphysics, like how a ball, if you throw a ball in the air, right, is that the movement of that ball, is that per se or accidental while it's going through the air, and how do you know? He makes that argument. I didn't really understand it, to be honest, because when I read it, I was really tired. But so I'll go back and reread that. But overall, interesting book. Very much borders on the edge of physics and philosophy, but you got you arguments about how time exists, how place exists, how if what a potential is and what an actual is, and all these sorts of things. They're important questions. So yeah, that's all. I'm Sinner. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.